Good morning, Dr. Eleonora Rossi. Thank you for joining us today. The first question we have is, people might learn a language in a formal and well-structured context of instruction or with an immersion experience. What are the differences between both methods of language learning?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. This is very interesting. We know that language learning is very complex, especially when we learn a language after childhood. So when we are children, we might learn our language or languages in very different ways. But when we learn a language after the age of 10 or 11, things get a little bit different. So normally what happens when people learn a new language after childhood in a structured environment, they might learn via explicit instructions. So we can use a lot of meta-linguistic knowledge when we are already adults, right? So imagine you are in a classroom where you are learning new words, new vocabulary, new grammatical rules, and that really goes through what we call meta-linguistic knowledge, but also explicit memory. So we learners normally utilize a lot of those explicit memory loops to learn words and grammatical rules. So then what happens when we might have the good chance to be immersed in an environment where we hear that language, imagine you're going to study abroad for 6 months or a year, things get kind of very similar to maybe what a child might be experiencing when you are young. So linguistic information is embedded in the environment, so the statistical information about the language is everywhere. So you might hear new words, new ways in which people say things. So the variability of the input is very high, and we know from research that that's very important for language learning. So the variability of the input. At the same time, when we're immersed in a naturalistic environment, we might utilize, maybe even without knowing that we are doing that route, we might be using more implicit memory loops such that we can use the language more fluidly. So when we are adults and we end up being immersed in an environment, we might even have a mixed model, right? So imagine you go study a language abroad, you might hear the language in the environment while at the same time engaging in much more structured learning within a classroom abroad. So we know from research, and also looking at research that uses neuroimaging methods such as looking at humans' brain waves. Here I have an example of a cat with some electrodes. We know that the way people learn in an explicit structured learning environment versus a more naturalistic learning environment is signaled by differences even at the brain level. So we see different signatures in the brain when people learn in different environments. So the research is still relatively new, actually, and we are really trying to understand in the latest type of research how variability in the input can really better the way we can learn a language past childhood. So I would say these are the two main points relative to the question that you asked.
Great answer, thank you. What are the memory systems implicated in or that underlie language learning?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is, again, another great question that really follows up beautifully to the first one. I already mentioned before that there is this difference in which we might use our memory systems to learn a language. Again, children, infants might learn through implicit memory, so they might not, selectively engage explicit memory where we are really learning by heart in a way what we really want to remember. And so these explicit and implicit memory loops we know engage differently when we learn a language. At the same time, models have proposed that, for example, learners can use a procedural or a declarative type of memory, which is very similar in a way to say explicit, implicit, because a declarative memory, utilizing declarative memory really means you are engaging explicitly in memorizing information. And we know that declarative memory loops, even at the neurophysiological level, are represented in the brain slightly in a different quote-unquote brain location than other memory neural pathways, right? When instead people start learning or learn through procedural memory procedures, it's like having, let me try to use an image, is like having knowing how to ride a bicycle and ride your bicycle without even noticing anymore what kind of movements you are utilizing to ride the bike. So that's a procedural type of memory, because we are really just oiling the system, and we know that that's also how people learn and utilize language information after they they typically get better in proficiency. In fact, there are very famous models that predict that at the beginning of learning, people learning a new language might use predominantly more declarative type of memory systems, while as they get better in the second or third language, they might engage more procedural type of memory. So, for example, I can give you an example from my own language learning. I learned English at the age of 16, even though I grew up speaking Italian and German. I do remember very clearly that in order to remember the verb paradigms of English, I had to spell out, both verbally and in writing, the verb paradigms, and I had to repeat them over and over again in order to remember how to write them in a text format. Fast forward 20 years, when I write or type, I don't use anymore those kind of declarative memory loops, but I just go through my procedural ones. So I will not think anymore how I have to spell a past tense that is an irregular past tense in English, because it now goes through procedural memory pretty much. So these are the two main types of differences between declarative and procedural memory that I think people use when they're learning languages.
And last question, is learning a second language the same for everybody, or are there individual differences among people?
Yeah, thank you. These, again, are very interesting questions. From recent, and maybe not even so recent research, but we know that actually there is huge variability in learning across individuals. And, again, we are here scratching the surface of what we know. And again, I'm bringing up neuroimaging methods. We know the capability of utilizing EEG or MRI measuring really enabled us to be able to look at variability in how people learn and process language. Many times, in fact, at the behavioral level, people might be really great at learning a language, or maybe not so great. But really, then when we can look under the hood at their brain measures, what we see is that people might be able to reach the same goal, but their neural engagement might be very different. So it might vary a lot. So what we are learning in the last 20 years of research is that there is massive variability in learning, but also the ways in which learners learn might be really tailored by their previous language experience, whether or not the language you're trying to learn is similar or different to your native language. And so we know that even the environment in which you are immersed, meaning, going back to the question you asked me before, even if your environment is a multilingual environment, that seems to make a difference in how people learn a new language when your environment is diversified. So we are at the cusp of really understanding how much variability there is. This seems to be curse in a way, but also a benefit of our research. But definitely we know that there is no simple one pathway to learning a different language, but there are many ways in which people can achieve learning. In my lab, we also do research looking at how people learn a language across the lifespan. And we know that depending on, I mentioned children before, but we also know that even when we are older adults or entering into our third phase of life, we can still learn, but the modes in which we are learning might differ relative to when we are young adults or children. So research at the moment is really engaging in trying to understand how these individual differences, even across the lifespan, pan out when we are learning a new language.